Hi, welcome to our introduction to Mark. I'm actually going to start a little bit farther out than Mark. I don't know how much Bible reading everyone's done, so if you're fairly familiar with it, the first couple of minutes here might be a little boring, but we'll get into some stuff that's more specific to Mark soon. I want to start by saying something about the whole Bible for those who might not be familiar with it. The Bible is broken down into two main sections. There's the part that we call the Old Testament, or some people call the Hebrew Scriptures, and there's the part that we call the New Testament, or what some people call the Christian Scriptures. Everything that's in the Old Testament was used by Jewish people back by the time of Jesus when he was alive 2,000 years ago. The part that we call the New Testament, or the Christian Scriptures, are writings that originated after Jesus' life. So as you open your Bible, the Old Testament, everything happened before Jesus 2,000 years ago, and the New Testament starts with Jesus' birth and moves on. Well, it gives a little bit of background in some of the Gospels, but it starts around the time Jesus was born and then moves forward to about 100 years after Jesus' birth is when it ends. So we're in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Mark, and the first four books of the New Testament are all called Gospels. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you might wonder why we're starting in Mark instead of in Matthew. It's mostly because I wanted to arrange our readings sort of thematically. I'll explain more about that when we start Peter. But Mark was quite possibly the first gospel written, maybe even the first book of the New Testament written, although that may very well have been one of Paul's letters. Mark is also kind of the shortest and the most action-packed of all of the Gospels, and that's part of the reason why we're starting with it. Mark does not spend as much time on description or setting the scene as we see in some of the other Gospels. It's just a lot of action. He kind of jumps from miracle to miracle, from teaching to teaching, and really keeps the pace moving. So hopefully that'll help keep things interesting for you, and really get you a kind of a crash course in Jesus' life and ministry, and ultimately his crucifixion and his resurrection. So Mark will move through that very quickly. I keep saying Mark. The gospel has been traditionally ascribed to Mark. It doesn't actually say anywhere in the book specifically who wrote it. But since the end of the first century or the beginning of the second century, the tradition of the church has been that it was written by Mark, also known as John Mark. We'll meet John Mark when we get to the book of Acts in a few months or a few weeks. It'll be a little while. But when we get to Acts, we'll meet John Mark and learn a little bit more about him. He was an associate of Paul and then also Peter. He was actually much closer with Peter. And a lot of people think that Peter probably had a lot to do with the writing of Mark's gospel. Mark is not listed as being one of the 12 apostles or necessarily one of Jesus' disciples directly. We have reason to think that he may have been a follower of Jesus during Jesus' earthly life. And I'll say more about that when we get towards the end of the gospel. I'm not going to be able to post videos every single day about our daily readings, but I hope that you'll talk to other people who are doing the readings with you. Maybe talk to people before or after church about it if you're part of our congregation, or you can feel free to post questions or comments on the church Facebook page, or I'm going to try to post this video to YouTube, and you can post comments there as well, or questions or whatever you happen to have. But I hope that you'll enjoy digging into Mark and seeing all of these stories. And the reason why we think Mark was a follower from early on is actually kind of funny. So I look forward to sharing that with you when we get to that video. But if you have any questions already, just from the stuff that I've said in this video, feel free to post them, and I'll do my best to check those and answer them. But we'll move through Mark. We're going to do 6 chapters a week because we're doing 1 chapter a day, and we're not doing Sundays for those of you who are following along in our reading plan. So this week will be Mark 1 through 6, and then next week will be 7 through 12, and then the week after that we're going to finish Mark and begin 1 Peter. As I said, John Mark was close with Peter. People think that Peter had something to do with the writing of his gospel, maybe not directly, but the Mark wasn't there for all the stories, especially when we get to things like the the Transfiguration, where it's just Peter, James, and John, and he learned about these things probably from Peter. So Peter at least had a little bit of influence on this gospel, we think, and so we'll do Mark's gospel, and then we're going to go right into Peter's letters, and then after we finish both of Peter's letters, we'll start over with another gospel. I should say one more thing about gospels. I should have put this earlier in the video, but if you're looking at your New Testament just in the order that they appear, they start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you read through all four of those straight through, it starts to sound kind of repetitive, and it can be a little confusing if you don't know what's happening. That's four different people writing four different accounts of Jesus' life and ministry and death and resurrection. And each one brings a slightly different perspective to it. When we start Luke, which will be our next gospel, I'll share a little bit more about some of the interesting and even a little bit controversial things regarding the writing of the Gospels and what order they were in. And was Mark first? Was Mark after Matthew? Those are kind of the two main theories. I tend to think that Mark was probably first, but that doesn't really matter to your reading. So, like I said, if you have any questions, post them, and I look forward to doing these readings with you. And if you're part of our congregation at Middleport United Methodist, we'll be talking on Sunday during the sermon about some of the things that we see in the first 6 chapters of Mark. So have a great week. God bless, and I'll talk to you soon.